just concluded as of today, Friday, December 10th. Magnus Carlsen beat Jan Nepomniachtchi through 9 games in order to retain his title as the World Chess Champion for classical time-controlled chess. The match was pretty even and pretty tense up until game 6, which is when the wheels started to fall off, unfortunately. So I'm going to go through the games now. Some of these early games I'm not going to spend too much time on. Also, because I did kind of, it's been a little bit since I've seen these games, so I kind of forgot a little bit of what happened, but we'll go through them now, talk about them on stream, in the video. And yeah, just as a reminder, I am not an extremely strong player, so I can't provide a certain high level of analysis that you may find in other channels. I just play chess and talk about it for fun because I enjoy it. But this has been consuming my life the last 2 weeks or so I wanted to talk about it here. First game, Jan Nepomniachtchi has the white pieces, and he opens with e4. Magnus responds with e5. Then Jan brings out the king's knight. Magnus responds with his knight. And Jan brings the bishop to b5, getting us into a Rui Lopez, also referred to as the Spanish opening. Now, you should get very familiar with the Rui Lopez because we did see it a number of times through this match. And then Magnus responds by pushing the a-pawn, basically either trying to push out the bishop or force it to capture the knight. Jan pushes the bishop back, retreating it to a4, and now Magnus brings out his kingside knight to f6. Jan castles, and although Stockfish wants Magnus to capture here, he instead brings the bishop out to e7. And at this point, there is not a lot going on. As you can see, it's a very, very slight advantage for white, and the engine wants Jan to bring the rook to e1. But, Jan does bring the rook to e1, there we go. And then b5 for Magnus, again pushing out the bishop or forcing an exchange, but obviously Jan is not going to exchange his bishop for a pawn, and then he's not going to allow the a file to be open for Magnus's rook. So Jan retreats his bishop to b3. Magnus castles. Jan pushes his h-pawn. As Ben Feingold would say, put it in h. Magnus brings his knight here. Then Jan captures Magnus's pawn on e5. Magnus captures the bishop on b3, trading off his knight for the bishop. And now Jan has an a file open for his rook. Magnus plays b7. Obviously double attacking this pawn with only being one defender for white, so white obviously pushes the pawn to reinforce his e-pawn. Magnus pushes his pawn to give another attack to the e-pawn. And then we have a trade where Magnus Magnus ends up taking with the queen. Jan brings his queen out, inviting an exchange of the queens. And Magnus is happy to play his bishop to d6, attacking the knight. Because if Jan takes here with his queen, Magnus can take with either his knight or his bishop, but then he has to also retreat. Jan has to retreat to this knight here, because Magnus could just take it there. Jan moves his king to f1, rook b8. Then finally, Jan captures with the queen. Magnus takes with the knight. Jan brings his bishop out here. Magnus pushes his c-pawn to c5. Knight f3 for Jan. Rook d8 for Magnus. And then Jan brings his knight to c3. Magnus moves his knight to b4. And then rook ec1 for Jan. Rook ac8 for Magnus. Knight e2 for Jan. Knight c6 for Magnus. Bishop b3 for Jan. Knight e7 for Magnus. And then finally, an inaccuracy, but bishop f4 for Jan, and I believe, was this? No. Okay. Magnus captures the knight there, it gets taken, and then they trade off the bishop for, Magnus trades off the bishop there, so now Magnus and Jan each have one knight, two rooks. Magnus has probably a slightly better pawn structure. As you can see, Jan has two sets of doubled pawns, one on the F file, one on the B file. Magnus's pawns he has them on the center on this side, away from his king, but these pawns are still undeveloped in front of the king. Magnus brings the rook to c6, Jan brings the rook to e1, Magnus retreats the knight, brings it into the center. Jan pushes the c-pawn, Magnus again moves his knight, attacking this unprotected pawn here. So then Jan brings the rook up to protect it. Magnus plays king to f8, which is considered an inaccuracy. It wanted him to play g6 instead, which would have actually put him into a winning position, but he does that. Jan takes his knight to g2, Magnus, knight to f5, obviously attacking the rook. Jan plays rook e5, now Magnus plays g6, knight e1 for Jan, and then Magnus retreats his knight to g7. As you can see, all through this game, the eval bar basically even. We get another few moves here, back and forth. I'm just going to quickly go through these because this was one of those games that was just kind of a grindy draw, and then we get a threefold repetition, and the game ends in a draw. So, that was game one. Oops. Oops. Let's go with history. Okay. I'm not going to talk too much about these games in here. Game 2, another draw. Game 3, another draw. Game 4, this was the game on Magnus's birthday. I'll talk about this one next. And here we have Magnus with the white pieces, Jan with black. Yeah, and around this time, there was a lot of people talking about, especially on social media, Reddit, Twitter, people talking about how classical chess is so boring because at this level and with this time control, the players basically can just force draws. But one interesting thing through these first few matches, and honestly, it frames of the match is that Jan was playing much more quickly than Magnus, and he was hardly at the board. And that is a criticism that will come back later, especially as the match begins to turn in Magnus's favor. So here we have Magnus with the white pieces. We again open with e4, e5. Magnus with the kingside knight opening, but unlike the last time, this time Jan plays knight to f6. Lee Chess is referring to this as the Russian game, but it's more commonly referred to as the Petrov. Magnus captures the knight, or Magnus captures the pawn, rather, on e5 with his knight. Jan pushes his pawn to d6, Magnus retreats his knight, and then Jan captures Magnus's pawn on e4. Magnus pushes his d-pawn to d4. Jan brings his pawn down to d5. Then Magnus brings his bishop up here, attacking the knight. Jan brings his bishop down. Magnus castles. Jan castles. And about this time, basically all the streams and everything. So during this entire match, there were multiple streams going on. Hikaru was streaming these, chess.com was streaming these. Fide had a stream with Vishwanathan Anand, which was pretty insightful, but a little dry in my taste. Chess24 had two different streams. One of them had Anish Giri and Judith Polgar, which was pretty interesting. Anish had some pretty strong reactions to some of these later games. But overall, my favorite stream during the WCC, and the one I watched most frequently, was the chess.com stream with Danny Rech, Fabiano Caruana, and Robert Hess. That entire, I just thought they had really good chemistry, really fun lineup. So if you want to go back and watch some of these games, watch the full broadcast, I would recommend the chess.com live streams for these games. But anyways, back to what I was saying about this time. All the streams were calling it, they're predicting another draw. And I'm not one to avoid spoilers here. This did end up being another draw. Like I stated before, this game did take place on Magnus's birthday, so there were some people that were probably hoping that because it was his birthday and because he had the white pieces, Magnus would push for his first win here, but Magnus seemed content at this point to play safe, accept the draw, and move the match towards the faster time controls where he feels more confident. We trade off the queens here, but Magnus was smart. Instead of just capturing and letting the knight take, that's probably what I would have done. He's a much better chess player than me. He takes with the pawn there, opening up the a-file for his rook. Does not take en passant, by the way. The engine wants Magnus to take en passant here. And if he does, I think he might have a win with perfect play. I'm not sure. Yeah, he's like +2. It's probably still a draw, but Anarchy Chess not happy about Magnus not taking en passant. He moves his knight to h4 instead. And again, we just get a series of moves here marching us towards an inevitable draw. And I think we get a threefold repetition right there. excitement happened. Game 6. Now, I got up, and I watched all of these games in this match from beginning to end, basically. And let me tell you, this game here, Game 6, you have Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces. This game was intense. About nearly 8 hours. This game was nearly 8 hours. I watched the entire thing beginning to end. I had Ceci up on my phone, like looking at the engine, looking at the analysis of the position, and there was a point towards probably the last hour and a half or so of this match where I was like literally sitting here in my computer chair just dripping with sweat. It was so intense. But yeah, Magnus with the white pieces, and he opens with d4. I believe this was the first time Magnus opened with d4 for the entire match. Jan responds with the Indian defense, bringing out the knight to f6. Magnus brings his knight up, and then we have the d5 for black. Magnus pushes his pawn to g3, e6 by black, and then a bishop g2 for Magnus. And then we get castles in this position. Magnus pushes his b-pawn, c5 from Jan, takes, and then Magnus pushes the pawn to c4, and we are officially out of Masters database. As you can see, at this point there were some games here that the position had been seen before, but c4 by Magnus took us out of history games. Then d takes c4. Magnus brings his queen to c2. Jan brings his queen to e7. Knight d2 for Magnus. Knight c6 for Jan, and then Magnus captures with his knight on c6. b5 for Jan. Then knight to e5 for Magnus. Jan brings his knight down, putting an attack onto Magnus's queen. Magnus moves the queen to b2. b7 for Jan. a3 for Magnus. And then Jan retreats his knight to c6. And I believe already at this point Magnus was down about half an hour on the clock. Oh no, actually we do have the clock right here. So where was that long think for Magnus? Magnus had one long think here. I think it was... Okay, so knight takes c4 took Magnus 11 minutes to think of, and you can see Jan has an hour and a half left. Jan thinks for just a little bit of time before making that move, and then Magnus takes 21 minutes to think of knight to e5. And then, yeah, like I said, this was a theme of the match. Jan playing moves very quickly, just a couple of minutes to think, while Magnus would sit there, like even in the first few opening moves, and calculate for 10, 20, 30 minutes. Very distinct difference between the two players, for sure. Magnus brings his knight back to d3, launching an attack on this bishop. The bishop retreats. Then now Magnus brings his bishop to g5. Jan brings his rook to d8. Magnus takes with the pawn for Jan. Now Magnus brings his rook out to c1. Knight d4 for Jan. Magnus takes with his knight. Obviously, Jan takes with the bishop, putting an attack onto the queen. Magnus retreats his queen there. Jan captures g2 with his bishop. Magnus takes back on g2 with his king, and then Jan delivers a check with his queen on b drops his king back down to g1. Jan's queen is here, and I'm just going to fast forward a few moves now until we start to get to the really interesting part. So as you can see here on move 24, Jan Nepomniachtchi has 37 minutes and 41 seconds remaining. Magnus Carlsen has 46 minutes, 10 seconds remaining. The engine wants g7 here from Magnus, but Magnus takes 23 minutes to think, and he puts his rook onto d2. So Jan now has 14 more minutes on the clock compared to Magnus. Jan brings his rook out to c8 after a quick 5-minute think. Then Magnus, this move is where things get very spicy, very interesting. And this is where the chess.com commentary, they get very hype after this move, and this move kind of indicated that we were in for some fireworks in this match. Magnus thinks for about 7 minutes, captures, sacrificing his queen to get rid of both of Black's rooks. So we now have Black still has the queen, but White has 2 rooks. Black has the bishop, White has the knight. At this level of play, at the Grandmaster level, 2 rooks for a queen is considered equal. I know me, at my level, not being very good, I get very uncomfortable if my opponent has a queen and I don't, which is why I tend to try to get both of our queens off the board as quickly as possible. But this was a position also now where people were starting to get nervous because of the time situation. It's only move 27 right now. If you didn't know, once the players reach move 40, they get an additional hour on the clock. So Magnus has to make 13 moves with only 18 minutes, meaning he has just barely over 1 minute to think per move. Jan puts his queen on d5. Magnus pushes his b-pawn, or puts his queen on d5, not his pawn. Magnus pushes his b-pawn, Jan pushes the a-pawn, and now another long think for Magnus, and now this is, people were really getting concerned here. As you can see, Jan blitzed out these moves. He still has over half an hour on his clock. Magnus has 17 minutes on his clock. But Magnus thinks for 8 minutes before pushing his pawn to e3. So now he has to make 11 moves in 9.5 minutes. He has just under 1 minute per move now. And Jan has 31 minutes. He thinks for about 4 minutes before putting his bishop to a5. Then Magnus thinks for 3 minutes. 3 minutes before pushing his pawn to h4. So it is now move 30. Again, Magnus has to reach move 40 to get 1 additional hour. And he has 6.5 minutes to make the 10 remaining moves to meet the time control. But then Jan makes his first inaccuracy. It wants the bishop to come here, obviously, causing some mayhem. I'm not sure why. I think there's a reason this can't take, and I think it's this. This is just winning for Black. So it wants Jan to bring his bishop here, but he pushes the h-pawn to h5. Magnus thinks an additional 3 minutes before playing his king to h2, so he now has to make 9 moves in 3 minutes, and Jan still has 23 minutes left on his clock. The engine wants the queen to come down to b3, but Jan plays finally b2, but 1 move late. And this now is swinging the evaluation bar into Magnus's favor, plus plus 0.1.3. Magnus thinks for all of 3 seconds before pushing his rook to c5, obviously forcing the queen to retreat, and Jan does retreat the queen, but to the wrong square. As you can see right here, it's plus 1.3 for white. It wants Jan to come up here to d7. But Jan, after about a 5-minute think, puts his queen up to d6. Now, plus 5.7 for white. It wants the rook to come down here to d1, which is causing a lot of damage. That's a lot of damage. But Magnus, understandably, because he only has 3 minutes left on his clock, only takes 3 seconds here and pushes this pawn to this rook rather to d1. This is a blunder. This is a straight up blunder according to the engine. But again, he only took 3 seconds to think here because he was in time trouble. Jan is now down to 9 minutes 55 on his clock. He thinks for about 40 seconds before capturing the pawn on a3. Magnus captures the b5 pawn with his rook. Now it wants queen up there, and Jan plays it. Jan now in a winning position. Magnus brings his rook to c5, and Jan pushes his e-pawn instead of capturing Magnus's pawn there on b4. Inaccuracy again, but Magnus, he has 2.5 minutes here. Move 36, he thinks for about a minute and 20 seconds, and plays this rook to d5 move, or excuse me, rook to c2 move, which is a inaccuracy. Jan is now up 1.5 points. He has 3.5 minutes to make 4 moves. Magnus has a minute and 10 seconds to make 4 moves. And then Jan makes a blunder. He gives up all 1.5 points of his advantage with this move, queen to d5. And on the chess.com stream, I remember, I think it was Robert Hess, he immediately called this out as a mistake. He said that it gave up his advantage. He immediately recognized that. Magnus thinks for about 30 seconds, brings his rook to d2. Jan brings his queen to b3. Magnus goes rook a2. He has 32 seconds left. Jan has a minute 27. And then Jan thinks for just under a minute. He thinks for 59 seconds. And he makes the blunder of playing e4, which, as you can see, the evaluation bar is now swung back to white. And it wants Magnus to play his knight here. Obviously, the queen is forced to retreat, and then Magnus wins a pawn. Although, the Stockfish wanted that to be... Oh, it did not want that to be played. It wanted it to this. I see. That's what it wants Magnus to do. Magnus plays the knight there. He has 30 seconds left. 1 move to make. Jan captures there. And then Magnus does capture the pawn, so Magnus actually makes the blunder that I suggested. But as you can see, he has 30 seconds left. Jan has 25 seconds left. And Jan makes this move, queen to b3, with 5 seconds remaining on the clock. So at this point, we have reached time control. Each player gets an extra hour added to their clock, and both players immediately left the board to go back, probably get a drink, catch their breath, get a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever. And Magnus comes back 20 minutes later, plays rook to c2. Now I am going to speed this up a bit because this game just gets really grindy right here and not a lot is happening. Obviously, both players are just kind of fighting for small little advantages here. Just, very positional game. We're at move 52 here, and again, just then finally we get our first capture after 10 moves. Rook takes e4. And then the queen comes and captures here. positional game where neither side is really getting an advantage. Jan delivers a check here, but as you can kind of see over the course of these last few moves, Magnus has built a bunker around his king, and this is going to become very important later. Another thing to note is, again, look at the clock. Right here, move 58, Magnus has just under 10 minutes on his clock. Jan has 15 minutes on his clock. Once the players reach move 60, the second time control is activated. After move 60, the players get 30 seconds added to their clock after every move. So Magnus has about 10 minutes to make 2 moves, 5 minutes to think per move. Jan has 15 minutes to make two moves. Now obviously you're only getting 30 seconds added each time. They don't get an entire hour back like they did before. So it is still advantageous to have a lot of time left on your clock as you reach move 60. Jan plays d5 check, and Magnus thinks for 5 minutes before pushing the f3 pawn. Jan thinks for about 3 minutes before playing this move, queen to d1. Magnus has 4 minutes left, and he thinks for basically all of them before pushing this f4 pawn. I'm not sure where okay, he has 16 minutes now, so I think they get like 10 minutes added. Well, that doesn't make sense because he had 4. They get some amount of time added plus the increment. I guess we'll see right here because Jan has 10 minutes and then he goes up to 24. So I'm not sure the exact, but they get a little bit of time back plus increment. Okay. And we've now reached time control 60 minutes, and this is where, at this point, everybody is still predicting this to be a draw, just a very long, drawn-out draw. However, Magnus Carlsen is the best player in the world when it comes to endgames, because Magnus Carlsen has a lot of mental and physical stamina. These long, drawn-out games do not faze him. At the board, he does not get tired. He just keeps pushing and pushing. And one term that a lot of people like to use to describe Magnus is that they say that he draws water from stone, which I think is a very apt metaphor for what Magnus does. Magnus plays f2 here. Jan brings his bishop to b6. Magnus drops his rook here to a1. Here. Again, I'm just going to go quickly through the moves. Magnus just getting a very drawn-out endgame. He's threatening, to deliver checks here on this back rank. Again, just repositioning, looking for small little advantages. Not a lot happening here. And again, even at this point, people are still predicting a draw. But then this is an inaccuracy, and I believe this is where things start to take a turn a little bit. I think this is where Magnus kind of starts to believe that he can get a win out of this. Most people still don't believe he can, but I think this is where he starts to realize that if he can bunker correctly, reposition correctly, he can get a win. And right there, Magnus captures a pawn. Another pawn, sacrificing his rook. Magnus is just slowly positioning his pieces to try and grind this out and to grind Jan Nepomniachtchi down. Now, one thing that also should be noted is that there is a 50 move rule. If a pawn is not pushed or there is no capture in 50 moves, then the game ends in a draw. So, at this point, Magnus has to eventually push a pawn or capture a piece if he wants to continue playing this game. Here, Magnus does make a mistake and an accuracy knight to g5, but he delivers a check, and apparently, this is a move that the engine doesn't even see, but it's the correct move, which is pretty wild that he's able to do that. There's a point where people were saying that Magnus Carlsen basically has Ceci built into his head. Move 107, we get a check, and just slowly, and there we go. Magnus finally able to push a pawn on move 110, and with the 50 move rule in place, this guaranteed that we were heading towards the longest game in world chess championship history. I believe the former record was 134 moves, I believe, and we do get past that in this game. And as you can see, not a lot of action, just slow positioning of all the pieces. And this is just Magnus doing what he does best. And he's slowly marching his pieces up the board. He knows exactly what he has to do. And he pushes his pawn again on move 129. And, Magnus started with all his pieces down here. He is now all the way up onto the 5th and 4th rank with his pawns. They're protected by the rook, and the knight is protecting his king. The queen can't do anything in this position, and Jan does not have a pawn on the board anymore. And right here, this move, queen to e6, is the inaccuracy that seals the fact that Jan will lose this game. Magnus repositions, brings his knight up here, and it is now plus 3.1 for Magnus. I was watching the live stream, and they were literally all sitting there going, like, look at the eval bar, look at the eval bar, like, they were going insane. Magnus pushes his pawn again. It is now plus 7.1. Now you may be thinking, can't Jan just capture here? Well, no, he can't, because if he captures there thinking he can get rid of the rook, Magnus can do this. And then when that happens, you retreat the knight, and Magnus can just come in here and push his pawn up the board. So, even though it looks like the rook might be open to capture, that guarantees the loss for Nepomniachtchi. And Magnus is currently in an objectively winning position. But as you can see, he only has just over a minute on the clock, and Jan has 3 minutes. So Jan, another blunder right there. I think this was Jan's first blunder of this match. But as you can see, as soon as Jan plays queen to g6, Magnus Carlsen now has mate in 20, and all he has to do is push the rook, and he sees it. This still says this still says that the best move is to capture here, but you have the same thing. And this is just winning for white. So he cannot capture that rook, even though the best move for black in this position is still one that leads to a checkmate. That's how bad this position is for black. He moves his king, then Magnus. Also this move right here, rook to f7. I believe this was the move that officially broke the record for longest game. It was either e6 or rook to f7. One of those two was the record-breaking move. I don't recall which it was. Then black moves his king to d8. Magnus, he could get greedy. He could play here. side. And in this game, we got that game, and we got the longest game in World Chess Championship history. And at this point in the match, in Game 6, Magnus Carlsen is now leading 3.5 to 2.5, and the first player to 7.5 points wins. If you're not aware, it is 1 point for a victory, half a point to each side for a draw, 0 points for a loss. Game 7, I'm not going to break it down, but people thought Game 7 was going to go one of two ways. Either it would be a quick draw after a very long, drawn-out game. It was about just under 8 hours, and like I said, over 130 moves in Game 6. People thought either it'd be a long, drawn-out draw, or that Jan would have been completely broken down and give up another loss. But in this game, it is the former, not the latter, and we get a draw after a hard-fought game. Then I believe they have a rest day after Game 7, and Magnus Carlsen gets another chance with the white pieces in Game 8. What is our recording time right now? 43 minutes. This might end up being the longest video on my channel, but that's okay. You guys have been getting a lot of long videos lately. Magnus again with the white pieces. The current scorecard to this point is Magnus with 4 points, Jan with 3 points after the draw the day before. And Magnus plays e4, Jan responds with e5. Magnus plays f3, Jan plays f6, and we are back to a Petrov. And again, every Petrov that they had played before this ended up with a draw. So people were expecting another draw in this game. Here, captures, and then we get into this very interesting symmetrical position. And as you can see, like, as soon as this happens, by move 8, there are no more database games. Petrov, modern attack, center variation. Both players' knights are off the board, and we have this symmetrical line where each player has their queen, bishop, bishop, pawn, pawn, bishop, bishop, queen. Very strange position. I had never seen a position like this before, and a lot of people were kind of confused about this, but the players seemed to be out of prep almost immediately, which usually leads to very interesting games. Magnus castles. Jan plays pawn to h5. Magnus delivers a check with the queen on e1. Jan retreats his king. Magnus brings his bishop out to b4, offering this. But Jan is smart. He plays queen to e7. Magnus trades off that bishop. Magnus still up, but just slightly here. And then Magnus plays queen to d2. Again, we are back in a symmetrical position. White. Black. Just like that. Pretty funny how that happens. Symmetrical position. And then black plays rook to e8. White matches it, offering up a trade. Black plays rook to h6. Magnus brings his queen out into g5. Black pushes the c6 pawn. Magnus takes. Black takes the bishop. And then rook to e1. Queen f6. Queen e3. Bishop d7. Magnus pushes the h3 pawn. Jan cuts off its movement with h4. Magnus plays c4. Jan captures. Magnus captures back with the bishop. And at this point, right here, move 21, Magnus has 18 fewer minutes than Jan, but everybody was convinced we were heading towards yet another draw, which at this point Magnus does not match, he still wins and retains his title. So everybody was kind of assuming, okay, another draw. But then Jan plays b5, which is a mistake. And then, if you don't know why this is a mistake, here Magnus is going to show you, obviously. And this is the first time, and I'll talk about this now, where the criticism of Jan Nepomniachtchi and his tactics and playstyle during this match starts to become pretty vocal. Because as you can see, he only took 4 minutes on this move. Magnus comes here, delivers the check, Jan is forced to retreat to the king, and as you can see, Jan just hung upon. It is a world championship, and Jan just hung upon by playing that b5 move. Check, retreat, take, and if Jan takes, now Magnus has also won a bishop, and this is just a disaster. Now it's the top engine move is to put the queen on d8, or excuse me, the queen on to d6. But Jan plays queen d8, and Magnus retreats his bishop, and this is now an objectively winning position for Magnus. He's up 2 points on the evaluation. He's up a pawn, and at this level, being Magnus Carlsen, he does not lose games like this. He just simply doesn't. And the commentary teams, this is where they really start to lay into Jan for the first time. After game 6, they were pretty forgiving because it was such a long end game, both time-wise and move-wise, that it's easy to make mistakes. And all those other GMs, they recognize that Magnus is like the best endgame player that's ever existed. So there's no shame in losing it a hard-fought endgame against Magnus. Use it to find your opportunity to bounce back and fight for a win down the line to equalize the match. But playing, barely thinking, just playing for 4 minutes, or thinking for 4 minutes rather, and playing a mistake that sacrifices a pawn, a lot of people were saying it was inexcusable. And this is where the criticism of Jan frequently leaving the board starts to get pretty loud, because during this entire match, Jan would play a move and then immediately retreat back to their green rooms. They had, like a sofa, a television that showed the position on it, some snacks, some drinks, stuff like that. And Jan would kept doing this thing where he would come out, blitz out a move really quickly, and then go back to his room. Now he was saying that it was easier for him to think looking at the digital board on the television compared to the physical board at the table. But again, the criticism was getting pretty loud at this point. They're like, he needs to stay at the board, he needs to think longer than just a few minutes, like he can't keep hiding away, because it almost seemed like he was too scared to sit at the board with Magnus and like face him, look him in the eye, Rook d6 is a blunder. It wanted this because that cuts off, any of this action here, but Jan plays d6, which is a blunder. Magnus is now up plus 4.5, and it's basically a guaranteed win at this point. The commentary teams weren't even talking about potential draws or anything anymore. It was just talking about how is Magnus going to win this? How is Jan going to recover from being 2 games down? And, it's just, at this point, there's not much Jan can do. Magnus is just going to march down. This is a mistake, but as you can see, right here he's plus 14. Right here he's plus 8, so it is a mistake, but he goes from definitely winning to definitely winning, so it's not much of a mistake. And Jan makes a few more moves, tries to get something going, but at this point, after Magnus plays f3, Jan Nepomniachtchi resigns. So we go from having no wins in 5 years to having 1 win in 5 years, and then just 1 on Jan Nepomniachtchi. What is this? This was game 8. So coming into this game, it was, let's see, it was 3-4. Yeah, it was 3-4 coming into this game. But now after this game, after Jan Nepomniachtchi resigns, it is 3-5 in favor of Magnus Carlsen. And at this point, it's just a matter of how and when, and not if, Magnus will retain his title as the chess champion. Because nobody is, or excuse me, some people have come back from down 2 games, but that was with the old rules where you had to get a certain number of wins, not a certain number of points. You know, they would have dozens and dozens of games to decide the winner, not a maximum of 14. So that was game 8. Then we come into game 9, which is, this one was rough, because you have now Magnus Carlsen as the black pieces. Jan Nepomniachtchi is white, and he needs to get a victory. He needs to get a victory because he's down 2 games, and after 14 games, this thing is decided. So he has 5 games to get 2 wins and get himself back into this thing. And Magnus, during his time as champion, has only lost 2 classical games during the chess championship. So, and that's over all the years, all the matches against different challengers. Jan now needs to get 2 victories in 5 games. He's basically climbing Mount Everest at this point. Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. He opens with c4, so a deviation from e4 or d4, which is the 2 most common openings. Magnus plays e6, g3 from Jan, d5 from Magnus, g2, and then Magnus pushes this, and I'm just going to, push through here. We have an English opening. This video is quite long, so I'm just going to start, pushing through these at this point, because we've already kind of gotten through the most consequential games, in my opinion. Just, solid play here. There's a lot going on. But as you can see here, draw. This is basically all even. This is all even. But, as you can see at this point, where was the big thing for Magnus? Was it here? Yeah, it was here. Because here at move 22, Jan Nepomniachtchi has 56 minutes, 41 seconds. Magnus Carlsen has 22 minutes, 13 seconds. Another criticism of Jan Nepomniachtchi, and this is one that I personally leveled at him, is that even though it did not work the first few times, he kept blitzing moves, trying to put time pressure on Magnus, even though it hadn't worked, and he had already lost twice using the strategy. He somehow was still under the belief that if he could put Magnus under time pressure, he could beat him, even though he now had substantial evidence to the contrary. I don't know how he was still able to think that this was a good strategy for him. It kind of seems insane to me, to be honest, but that's what he was doing. Jan's strategy was to continue to play quickly, to try and put pressure on Magnus using the clock, and Magnus never seemed bothered by it. And it never became an issue. And this is the beginning of the end here for Jan. As you can see, they've just traded off queens. Jan has this bishop here on g2. chess championship history, because this move basically sealed Jan Nepomniachtchi's fate and guaranteed that Magnus Carlsen would retain his title. It was basically already guaranteed after his loss in Game 8, but this took it from like a 98.9% chance Magnus would win to like a 99.999% repeating chance that Magnus would retain his title. And that's the move c5. And as you can see here, the position's basically even. White is just barely up. Negative 3.8 with the move c5. And the reaction to this move was immense. Anish Giri on stream asked if Jan Nepomniachtchi was nuts. I believe he asked what's wrong with him. He had a lot of very strong words to say. Anand, Vishwanathan Anand, he said that, Jan had basically completely fallen apart mentally, that, his heart wasn't in it anymore, he couldn't even think straight. And the worst part is, look at the clock, 54 to 49, he only thought about this move for 5 minutes. Jan had over 30 minutes of advantage on the clock. There was no reason to blitz out this move, and there was no reason to not think longer about it, because as soon as Magnus plays c6, White's bishop is trapped. No matter what White does, he has lost this bishop. And if you go down a piece against Magnus Carlsen, you're going to lose. Like, that's just the simple truth of it. You are going to lose. And what the interesting thing, if you see here, Magnus has 17:29 here. He thinks for 3 minutes. Because as soon as Jan plays this move, Magnus's face is like shock and disbelief. And he was saying that he thought that there was no way it could have been a blunder, and there must be something that he was missing. So he was sitting there calculating, like, what am I missing? What am I missing? There's no way he would just blunder a piece. But for the second game in a row, Jan did blunder a piece, although this time instead of blundering a pawn, he blundered a bishop. And his bishop's now trapped. He plays f3, which is really the only move here. Putting an attack on the knight, but knight retreats. Rook retreats. And that is the death of that pawn right there. Takes, and then he pushes there. Takes. And here it's negative 4.7 for black. And Magnus Carlsen marches his way to victory. To an easy victory with the black pieces. It is one thing to win with the white pieces. You start with the advantage. But Magnus won with the black pieces. Significantly harder to do, especially at this level. And right here, after rook to a8, Jan resigned because there's basically nothing he can do to gain advantage. And as you can see, he still has 13 minutes left on the clock. And I forget who said it, but one of the commentary teams said that Jan is playing like he can take the time with him to the next game. Harsh, but definitely fair. Also should be noted that before this game, Jan cut his hair. He had been sporting a man bun for many years at this point, and he cut his hair between Game 8 and Game 9, probably. Hope just to change things up, look good, feel good, just, whatever. But the haircut did not save him here. I'm not going to talk about Game 10. Game 10 is a draw. And after Game 10, the scoreboard is 6.5 points for Magnus Carlsen, 3.5 points for Jan Nepomniachtchi. And then we come to Game 9, which is the game that just concluded earlier today. And we have Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces, Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. video. We are already at an hour, 2 minutes. So thank you to all of you guys who are still here with me at this point, that are sticking it out. Hopefully you are able to get some relaxation from this. But again, just playing through here, looking at everything, just going through the moves. Everybody was wondering at this point if Jan would lose again, if he was basically going to go full tilt and lose again, or if we were just going to get 2 draws. The questions were basically like, does this end on Friday, or does this end on Saturday? Moves, even position, everything here is looking solid, looking even. And then Jan does it again. C5. Another blunder as the white pieces. Magnus plays C6. Wait, this is game 9. What the heck? I went to game 9 again. I was going to say, hold on, that's not how this game went. Okay. Game 11. Jesus. Game 11. This time we have an Italian game. I was sitting there, I was like, wait, this doesn't look right. Pushing through here. I'm just going to go through the moves quickly because this game was looking drawish. And like I said, people were talking, does the game end today? Does the game end tomorrow? But Jan made a different blunder this game. Not a C5 blunder. G3. Here's an even position. Literally 0-0. Negative 7.5. Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces again getting a winning position. And there were some commentators that were actually suggesting that Jan was doing this on purpose because he wanted to lose. He didn't want to play 2 more games against Magnus. He only wanted to play 1 more game. He didn't want to spend another day there in Dubai. He just wanted to, go home, get this thing over with, because it was basically done and dusted already. But I think the fact that he continued to play on in this position after his blunder shows that he wasn't losing on purpose. I think Jan had fully tilted at this point. He couldn't even calculate correctly anymore. Like, I legitimately think his ability to, calculate positions was just gone at this point. Magnus had completely broken his mind, his spirit at this point. Magnus gets a queen here. I mean, look at that. Magnus gets a queen, and, it's so rare to see a promotion to queen at this level, but there you go. After B6, look at this. It's negative 10, negative 4, negative 58, negative 61. This is basically a guaranteed victory. Magnus plays C5 here. He has checkmate in 25, and at that point, Jan Nepomniachtchi resigned the match. He resigned the game, resigned the match, and Magnus Carlsen wins the World Chess Championship 7.5 points to, what was it? Was it 3.5 or 4? 7.5 points to 3.5 points. Magnus Carlsen wins. He retains his title as World Chess Champion, and to the surprise of everybody, he wins 4 games in this match. There had not been a win. There had not been a decisive game in 5 years. And Magnus Carlsen gets 4 of them in 1 match. Just a complete implosion mentally from Jan Nepomniachtchi. That game 6 loss, I still thought he could have bounced back from game 6. It was a hard-fought loss. I thought after game 7, getting the quick draw that boded well for him, he 6, which would then be the most in history. He would tie it. And if somehow he gets one more after that, even though he would be like 33, 34 at that point, he would be in sole possession of the most defenses. Jan Bonnegy automatically qualifies for the candidates tournament, which is how the challenger is determined. I do not think I would like to see Jan come back next year. I just don't think that he's... I think, Jan actually had advantage in some of the games leading up to Game 6. And there were points where I actually thought Jan would be able to beat Magnus, but his problem was that as soon as he lost one game, and this is something Magnus mentioned leading up to this match that Jan is prone to do, as soon as he lost one game, he just unraveled. He lost all of his confidence, and he just kept losing and losing and losing, and I don't think I'd like to see that happen again. I would love to see Fabiano Caruana come back. I think he still has like one good attempt in him, and Fabiano had some magnificent analysis during the chess.com live streams. He was finding a lot of really good lines, really good things that Jan could have done differently, so I'd love to see that. I think that Ding Liren could be a good challenger for Magnus. Ding Liren is a very strong player, and he would be the first ever world chess champion from China if he were to win, which I think could be pretty cool. Alireza Firouzja, I think, is probably going to be the next champion, whether he beats Magnus in 2023, which is when the next World Chess Championship is scheduled for, or maybe 2024, 2025, but Alireza Firouzja is definitely on his way up. He's only 19 right now, and he's the second highest rated player in the entire world, so we'll see what happens. But for the time being, Magnus Carlsen, my favorite player from Norway, my favorite country. He retains his title. Very, very entertaining. Very entertaining match. Obviously not super slick, not super, precise at the end, but fun to watch. And for my first time watching every single game of a World Chess Championship, I had a fantastic time. I cannot wait to watch the next one, and I hope you guys will as well. I'd love to hear any feedback you have about this. If you were watching the games, what you thought about it, what you thought about the match. Any comments you have at all, I'd love to hear it. Please leave a thumbs up if you liked the video, and subscribe to the channel for more content just like this.